I'm here with Anthony Hayes.
I'm just waving at the non-existent camera
Yeah,
here.
you do that. Okay. So, tonight I wanted to discuss the idea that two figures in avant-garde history, to wit, Andre Breton and Guy Debord, are popes. And the idea here is that they are authority figures. And the reason why this is important and the reason why this has been taken up is because the idea of the avant-garde, roughly stated, is to negate the difference between creativity, a specialised realm of creativity, and everyday life. So everyone is creative. Now, in the case of Andre Breton, he was a pivotal figure in the Surrealist movement, and the way in which he wished to negate the difference between specialised domain of creativity, namely art, and everyday life, was that he thought that everyone could reach inside themselves by an automatic process and produce beautiful poems through accessing their own unconscious reservoirs of fantastical imagery automatically, such as through automatic poetry, writing, a kind of a free-flowing consciousness or a stream of consciousness, a type of a technique. Now, Guy Debord and the Situationists took this further. They criticised the idea of the production of individual artworks and wanted this creativity to be wrought on environments themselves. So the Situationists in this sense are an extension of the ideas that we find in the Surrealists. I don't know, Ant, how do you feel about this initial summary of the positions?
I think you sort of get to the heart of the relationship between the Situationists and the Surrealists. Definitely Debord and the early Situationists saw themselves as not just the continuation of the Surrealists, but in many respects solving what they consider some of the central sort of contradictions of the Surrealists. Particularly over the question of the production of art. So the Situationists really thought that the Surrealists didn't resolve this problem that they identified, nonetheless, which was they wanted to use artistic practices like writing poems, even prose pieces, paintings, so on and so forth, but along the lines of what you've mentioned, using automatic techniques, the Surrealists called pure psychic automatism, and they wanted to use them in a experimental fashion. So the emphasis wasn't on necessarily the results of the experiments in the sense of, hey, I've created a poem or a painting or so on and so forth, but rather these results, well, I probably shouldn't say the emphasis isn't on the result, it's the way that you interpret the result, right? So they were more interested in the poems and the paintings, etc., that were produced using automatic techniques, what they would reveal about the nature of the human mind and human potentiality.
Right. So one thing that I'm thinking about this project is that, and I guess this is where the whole accusation of papery comes in, is that there's an anti-hierarchical or a non-hierarchical, an anti-authority aspect of this project. We want to be careful of identifying it with anarchism. I believe on good definitions of anarchism, certainly we can say that this avant-garde project had similarities with anarchism, but for instance the Surrealists had fraught relations with anarchist groups, and I believe the Situationists maybe did too.
Sure.
Yeah. Yep. So maybe a bit of care there, but look, it's nevertheless an anti-authority, anti-hierarchical practice and theory. Yet they were authority figures who, for instance, expelled people. So there were a couple of expulsions which are fairly famous, which are often taken to show that Breton and Debord were authority figures. Maybe you can tell us a bit about a couple of cases of expulsions, maybe of famous figures in the case of the Surrealists.
One thing that I would like to actually just say very briefly, and maybe we could talk about this later as well, it wasn't that Debord had sort of like put himself in a position where, my word is law and you must accept my word, and if you don't, then I'm going to kick you out of the group. Actually, I feel that it's the complete contrary of this in the case of Debord.
Well, okay, I do too, but I want to kind of make some arguments to kind of get to that.
Sure.
Because there's this line that gets towed, okay, and I first encountered it at the Lips of Coral, the 1993 Lips of Coral conference that the National Gallery of Australia put on around the good old Surrealist Revolution by Night exhibition, that famous exhibition. And I first encountered it there. I've encountered it at the Victorian College of Arts. I've encountered it elsewhere since. Okay, and you can read it in a lot of contemporary art theory. The idea that despite this apparent commitment to tackling hierarchies and authority, that there was this hierarchy and authority. And one idea here, I guess, is that, like, we're talking about a couple of cis white middle class males, I guess, and that they don't really understand how power works. They don't understand kind of like the microcircuits of power. The idea here is, and instead they've wound up instituting the very authority. By not understanding power, they've kind of wound up instituting the very authority that they claim to attack. Now, what I want to do in this, what I think we both want to do in this podcast is to very critically look at this orthodox idea, which I think is I know we both think is highly problematic. But I just wanted to table it first.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to construct a fictitious example here to take the conversation a certain way about this, and then maybe Ant, you can talk about how Debord and in particular was misrepresented, and probably Breton too. Now, the reason why I think that it's highly likely that there's misrepresentation going on here is that I think that what gets missed here is that people are trying to do something different. And I'm going to take an example from my own life, but I'm going to modify it a bit just for the ease of discussion. So I want you to imagine, dear listener, two men, two white cis male hetero whatever men, okay, and you know, because we're in this domain, we can use kind of boring names that you get with examples in analytic philosophy. Dave and John. Dave Brown and John Smith, right?
Yeah, I hate those guys.
Yeah, you know those guys, yeah. They're always miscounting coins and winding up with false propositions. Anyway, that's a different area. Anyway, so Dave and John. So, okay, so Dave maybe is a musician, and Dave thinks, oh, look, I'm really down on the way in which the way in which if you try to play in established venues, right, like they charge you a whole lot of money for the drinks, and they curtail what you're trying to do because they're after the yuppie dollar. And John's like, yeah, I'm really down on the way in which, as a visual artist, when you try to like exhibit in galleries with existing artist-run initiatives, you wind up with this emphasis on sales and this kind of competitiveness. And they get together and they decide that they'd like to have bands and show art under a bridge. Anyway, now what happens with this kind of stuff, in my experience, and Ant's experience I know as well, is that it can very often attract its own momentum, and sure enough it attracts its own momentum, right? Now I want to imagine someone comes along and we can say that she's a gay woman, just to bring out the identity politics issues here that surface, and let's call her Jane. Jane's like, look, I'm really enjoying this, but I think that, look, we've started to generate some notice, and I think it might be time that we've had these offers. They're actually offering to give us $100 at this pub to play and show our art, and this gallery is kind of interested in us, and we should be able to take the momentum that we've generated here, having gigs under bridges, which has attracted attention and people have had a good time, and we should be able to allow it for people to develop themselves outside of that idea. And John and Dave are kind of like, well, hang on. That wasn't really the idea of the group, right? The idea of the group was to do something different. And what Jane's proposing here is something that's out there all the time, okay? And so Dave and John get together and they expel Jane. Now, I think that if you look at this sort of slightly fictionalized, not even very fictionalized example actually, if you look at this slightly fictionalized example, what winds up happening is that it looks like Jane does represent democracy, right? She does represent kind of like this idea of someone standing up and saying, hey, why can't I do what I want to do? But at the same time, she sort of also represents homogeneity insofar as that, like, what she wants to do is already out there. And the question arises, well, why is she involved with this project? Why doesn't she just go out and do her own thing when there's a whole lot of her own thing already on offer? And why can't some people do what they want to do, even though it looks like they're being anti-democratic, and maybe in this case too, it looks like you've got this kind of like straight white guys telling like a woman, a gay woman, say that she shouldn't be included. But I think one thing that comes out of this is that is that maybe it's not just about democracy, and it's not just about power in the sense of these kind of identity politics, but it's also about an alternative, a real alternative to what's actually existing. So what do you think about that whole thought experiment / fictionalized example, etc.? And
I'm involved in a community group in my hometown,
Canberra.
Correct. And it's a community housing group, and because of a funding shortfall within our group, our management committee has investigated a possible sale and partial sale of some new housing that's been built by our group.
Right.
And in our last general meeting, I suggested that we should oppose this, simply because we are a small community housing group, and it would be a dangerous precedent for our group if we partially sold or completely sold parts of the housing community.
Right.
Now, there was another member of the housing group at that meeting who brought up the argument that we should be trying to address people's individual needs and desires.
Right.
And I feel that it raises some issues that are very similar to the issues that you've raised here. Because my response was, well, those needs and desires are already serviced by the existing market in the private sale of housing.
Right.
I don't see why a community housing group that is trying to help people in the face of a fairly uncaring and rapacious housing market should open itself up to the very forces that it's trying to actually deal with and feels threatened by. In fact, we're a tiny, tiny drop of water in a fairly large pond.
One thing I was thinking about this stuff, and I don't know if I'm going too far off in the tangent here, but is that democracy is kind of this fail-safe, right? Like, people rip you off and you've got like a democratic fallback, right? Like, if everyone's trying to rip each other off, then the idea that your voice can be heard is a way of protecting yourself, of covering your ass, as it were. But once you get to sort of people trying to do something different, where they've actually got a pre-established idea that they're trying to work out, like a research project, like you were talking about with the old avant-gardes, or a housing project, like you're talking about with your own experience, or a project about DIY art, then if you want democracy, it's in a limited sense that that people can critique and further the project. But you don't want people to be able to just come in from outside and say, fuck this project.
Sure. I think you've...
or even from inside.
You've really sort of like nailed one of the sort of problems here, which is, I think, if you have a collaborative project, and you agree upon a particular sort of like, the aims and maybe even the process, but, accepting that the process and the means to that particular aim might change over time as a result of trying to implement it. So, you're not inflexible, is I suppose what I'm really sort of trying
You're
to
not
get
too
at here.
dogmatic, but you've got certain pre-established ideas.
But the important thing is that you have a sort of collective project. Whereas the call for that those that sort of often sort of like come into a collaborative project who then want to take it in a sort of direction that is different to what was initially agreed upon, raise the cry of, this is not democratic if I'm not able to sort of like raise these issues and try and sort of bend the group to my will and so on and so forth. I think what that really fails to address is that it's to call into question the possibility or even the desirability of having this collaborative project in the first place.
I guess the issue there, I guess it depends on context, as many things do, but I suppose one issue there is that if the collaborative project, as you correctly put it, is to set up something that's different to what's around, then there seems to be a sense in which something's being lost if that difference is to be negated in the name of democracy, or that difference is to be negated in the name of giving any and all identities a hearing on the basis that they're those identities.
I mean, you could sort of just address this in a fairly sort of straightforward and banal sort of fashion. If we agree to build a house, let's say, and we have designs to build a house, and we have the means to build the house, and then someone either within that project or someone who joins that project raises the possibility that perhaps we shouldn't be building the house. I mean,
They should leave.
Well, it could be a legitimate sort of like question that's raised, depending on the sort of particular conditions. But if it's by mere virtue of the fact that this person should be listened to because everyone has their right to express, themselves and so on and so forth, I think there's nothing wrong with saying, well, if you're not interested in this project, then perhaps you should find another project to be engaged with.
Particularly if there's a whole bunch of other projects already existing that sound like what that person's into.
For sure. I mean, I think the confusion perhaps is that there's this like sense that someone's rights are being abrogated or even taken away completely by denying them the right to impose their own will upon a group. Maybe to clarify this and bring it back to sort of the question of the role of Debord and
Andre Breton.
And Andre Breton, is that those people who sort of like accuse Breton and Debord of being sort of popes or tyrants or so on and so forth, the picture they want to paint of Debord and Breton is precisely this idea of tyrannical individuals, that rule over a group. They're not genuinely engaged in a collaborative process. They're actually
dominant white male kind of characters who are exerting their power over other white males or otherwise.
If you examine the sort of like the two groups in question, the Surrealists and the Situationists, things are a little bit more complex. Certainly, Debord and Breton were significant individuals in those groups, and in both cases were responsible for many of the sort of leading ideas of the groups. But to actually represent them as tyrants, I think is deeply questionable, particularly if you pay attention to what actually went on. Both of them were very much committed to collaborative processes and were relatively tireless in trying to include other people in these processes. A very famous case, in the case of the Surrealists, is Salvador Dali. Dali, while he was a member for several years in the 1930s, began to tell the group about his obsession with Adolf Hitler, and he was dreaming about Hitler. He included Hitler in some paintings that he conducted in the 30s.
Yeah.
And this wasn't a passing sort of like interest on the part of, or even a sort of like a critical interest on the part of Dali. It became an obsessive interest that led Dali to embrace the Spanish phalangists, the fascists in Spain,
the Spanish Civil War,
who were a part of the the national side fighting against the Republic in the Civil War. And it also ultimately led Dali back to the Catholic Church. Now,
and the Catholic Church, listeners, was supportive of the fascists in the Civil War.
Correct.
So it was an institution which was openly behind fascism in the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s, I might say.
Well, you could also say the Catholic Church even more broadly supported the sort of fascists in Italy, and to an extent,
correct,
was sympathetic with the Nazis in Germany through the office of Pope Pius XII.
11th and 12th. Yeah, okay, so carry on.
A group that explicitly sort of represents itself as anti-capitalist and revolutionary, like the Surrealists, well within their rights to actually call into question a member's sort of interest in fascism. I think you'd be hard-pressed to represent the sort of Dali expulsion as an example of Breton sort of tyranny. It was a group process.
What about the expulsions that we were talking about in respect of the Situationist International, with say for instance the German Situationists? What would you say about them? Would you say something similar to what you're saying about Breton, that it'd be a misrepresentation to say that they were the result of the dictates of an autocrat in the form of Guy Debord's edicts?
Usually it's sort of represented that it's not so much sort of like Debord in this case, but Debord's circle, right? And
Van Eyck.
Yeah, Van Eyck, Attila Keaney, Alexander Trotsky, to a lesser extent Michel Bernstein. One of the interesting things about the Spur artists, like Spur was the name of a group of artists in Germany in the late 50s. Spur means the path or trail in German, yeah. And they were very influenced by, ideas from the Surrealist group and from the Dardas and so on and so forth. But very quickly it became apparent within the Situationist group after Spur joined that the Spur artists had very little interest in helping to elaborate a distinctive Situationist project.
Distinctive, yeah.
They were very interested in continuing to, paint paintings and sculpt sculptures and engage in a few occasional, let's say scandalous sort of outrages. The problem with Spur wasn't so much that they wanted to either sort of like actively disrupt or push the Situationists off a initial agreement. It was that they pretty much didn't want to sort of like engage at all in a collaborative project with Debord and Van Eyck and Keaney and others. They were very happy with a division of labour within the group. You French speakers, you go off and you work on the theory of the Situationists, and meanwhile, we artists over here in Germany, we'll do painting and we'll do scandals and so on and so forth. And none of the German group contributed at all to the elaboration of a distinctive Situationist theory. And I think this became a real sort of issue. It dragged on for years. And it was an issue if you look at the sort of 1960 conference and the 1961 conference of the Situationists.
We were talking a bit about the idea that that basically comes down to you want to do A and someone else wants to do not A. Yeah,
look, I think the problem with sort of like bringing up the strength of democracy, I suppose, in this case, is that it's fairly abstract unless you have a particular sort of like issue. What we're trying to get at here is this question of collaborative projects, you agree on particular aims and means to achieve these sort of aims. And I think there are real problems when you set up a project and then allow, I'm just trying to sort of like think...
of disruption.
Well, again, sort of like, I could imagine you sort of like representing the idea of a disruptive force in a positive way. Maybe disruption is good for the for the group. Maybe disruption is sort of like something that is a part of the health of the group.
Maybe we could just like talk about how there's like a lot of, I mean, if we're talking about, say for instance, the realm of Debord and of before him of Breton, we're talking about the realm of people looking at expression, particularly expression in the realm of culture and the arts, as a way of thinking about how we can generate a superior society. Now, as the 20th century continued, and particularly into the 21st century, there's a lot of talk about expression that deals with this or that market niche, right? But when you come to someone like Debord or Breton, they actually wanted to question the market itself.
Yep.
Okay. Now, I guess one idea here that I think is that, look, if you're not ready to question the market yourself, then I guess I know you don't agree with me, and I know you don't agree with Ant, because both Ant and I want to abolish the market and abolish capital. But one thing that's certainly clear is that there's a whole lot of avenues available to you to participate in the market, and it seems kind of odd to say that if I want to do something different, and I want to do A, which is question the market, and you want to do not A, which is not question the market, then I can't tell you basically to fuck off. And I think I should be able to tell you to fuck off. And I think that if you want to say to me, look, it's a question of identity politics, or it's a question of democracy, then I think what I want to say to you is that I'm interested in changing the world so that there aren't subaltern identities, and so that democracy perhaps isn't necessary. Now, you might want to say, well, look, isn't that a white male middle class thing? I'd say no. I'd say that what it's about is about a different way of doing things in which everyone can be a part, and that change of activity, I would say, is for across all identities is required increasingly urgently in an age of zoonotic viruses and environmental devastation and nuclear wars and all of the rest. So I guess I'm kind of thinking that there's two aspects to the defence of Breton and Debord. One is that, as Ant so eloquently put it, that in fact they're more collaborative than they're often presented as being.
Sure.
And I think the other is that they wanted to act in a new way, and that if people don't want to act in this new way, then it's not an issue of democracy, and it's not an issue of people being silenced. They either agree that there's an alternative to the market, or they don't. If they don't, then they should leave. And if you have to expel them from a group that's seeking DIY alternatives, or seeking alternatives on the basis of automata, the use of automata as Surrealists did, or on the basis of the radical remaking of environments, such as the Situationists proposed, then I think that not only insofar as that they acted along those lines, Debord and Breton before him justified, but I think today you would be justified in kicking people out of your group, and I think that there's nothing wrong with forming a group with a specific aim, and if people don't like it and they don't want to be part of it, and they want to be part of what's already out there, then they can fuck off, and you're not being a bigot, and you're not being anti-democratic or any such by saying that.
Sure. I don't see why it's such a controversial question to be able to say, look, I want to set up a group. I want to set up a group that wants to do, A, B, and C. Are you interested in doing A, B, and C with me? Sure. Yep. I'm interested in doing A, B, and C with you. And if someone else comes along and goes, well, I'm not particularly interested in A, B, and C. I'm really interested in D, and I think we should be doing D. I think you're justified in saying, well, we're not interested in D, so how about you go and find some people that you can do D with?
Who, as it transpires in context, that quite often are a lot of people.
The question I suppose I'm trying to raise here is why are we having these fucking sort of arguments with people who want to sort of get involved in groups often that, you know, you or I or people along similar lines to us initiate, but then demonstrably do not want to engage in the activities that first motivated these groups, and even sort of completely derail them from their initial.
What would you
projects.
say? What's the answer to that question?
Fuck off, I suppose, is the.
But the question is why? Why?
Oh,
Yeah, I think we're. I think fuck off is a good conclusion that's coming out of this podcast. But I mean, if we're asking before we conclude, perhaps maybe we can ask why do people behave like this?
Why do people behave like this? They've been brought up in market societies where
Career.
Yeah, I'm not sure, sort of like whether or not that is the case, or whether or not there's any point in even trying to sort of speculate over what motivates people.
Okay, so that's all I recorded of the conversation between Ant and I. It wasn't so much a debate as nutting out some points of agreement. We didn't tie up a certain loose end, which I'm going to tie up now, involving identity politics, which are very prominent in the current cultural context. So by the very nature of the orthodox criticism we responded to, we have come to a position where we've defended a couple of straight white guys, namely Andre Breton and Guy Debord. As well, in the fictionalised example, we had Dave Brown and John Smith. And indeed, there's a biographical element to this podcast which involves Ant and I, straight white guys. Now, when I say straight white guys, I mean a cluster of dominant identity characteristics, and by dominant I mean people who certainly haven't been silenced over the years. So I guess I'd be thinking about educated, and you could add cis, etc., etc. And there's plenty of writings from these people, plenty of cultural expression from these kind of people, and so the worry is, well, what about someone else gets to have a go, and what about a bit of diversity? Look, in terms of this podcast, the issue is that it begins to look a bit like that. In order to be revolutionary and oppose the market and provide something genuinely different, you have to be a straight white guy. As well, in the fictionalised example, Jane, who was a gay woman, got a bum rap. I think the best way in this context to talk to this worry is actually a brief history of surrealism prior to the rise of the Situationist International. And perhaps it's a bit odd that this is coming towards the end of the podcast, but nevertheless, I think that this shows why that position that you need to be a straight white guy to oppose the homogeneity around you is wrong, and as well, it shows why Ant and I might believe it's wrong. Okay, so I guess we're all pretty aware, and we handled the idea of Dali, that it was kind of straight white stars who took surrealism into existing art institutions and gained it mainstream and indeed conservative recognition. And so it became, in that way, less able to claim that it was providing something different. And we can think here, well, not just of Dali, who we've discussed, but also of let's stick with painters for the hell of it, Miro or Ernst at later moments in their lives. And by contrast, surrealism actually experienced something of a revivification and recaptured some of its heroic moments and providing something different to what was around it, and a challenge to the market society that was around it when it feminised in the 1930s. And I'm thinking here, if we stick with painters still, of painters like Remedios Varo, Lenora Carrington. Now, these women themselves wound up, to a certain extent, assimilated to the art institutional homogeny around them. But I guess that all I would say would be that those points of assimilation are not the whole story, and that certainly these women did provide an alternative. Toyin deserves a honourable mention as well. She was a tireless worker for surrealism as offering something different, as offering something that challenged the market, free market homogeny around her, and the market societies around her, however you want to describe the more authoritarian such societies that she encountered. She was a Czech woman, a gay woman, and she herself did also wind up with a certain amount of recognition, a certain amount of assimilation into the art, into art institutions. However, as I say, it's not the full story, and certainly with her, for instance, you can see how many tracts she signs that keep Surrealism radical up to and after the Second World War. As well, in the 1940s and the later 40s, in the immediate aftermath of the war, we should mention the Caribbean Surrealists, who, again, reinvigorated Surrealism with a return to its more heroic roots. And the Caribbean Surrealists were also, like Toyin, they were very courageous, opposing police means and so on, and coming out with some excellent writings about human potential. I'm thinking of sort of some of the work of, say, Renee and Susan Manil. Breton and Debord were defended on two grounds in this podcast. The first was that they offered something different, and they were in fact more collaborative than they're often given credit for, and we heard a bit from Anthony about that. We weren't just interested in these two men to justify their names historically or to draw out a lesson in the history of art. We're also interested in applying some of these ideas today. And just as we defended André Breton and Guy Debord from charges of being authoritarian, tyrannical characters, popes, on the basis of the expulsions they undertook, so too we argued that today, if you make a DIY group which offers a genuine alternative to what's already on offer in bucket loads, namely the market, namely art careers and so on, then you should be able to expel people. And the idea that you're not being democratic or that certain identities continue to be silenced, those responses in themselves aren't sufficient to suggest that you should refrain from expelling people. Of course, if you're going to undertake these kind of actions, and indeed if you're going to have such a project, then you need to have good reasons for what you believe in, and you need to have evidence and good arguments for what you believe in. And as Ant emphasised throughout the discussion, you need to be able to be flexible and not be too dogmatic, and that disruption sometimes, or the abandoning of a project sometimes is also a good idea, but not always. So in those cases where not always, boot them out and try and do something different. Try and help create a better world. It doesn't have to be about art. It can be about technology. It can be about housing. It can be about food. It can be about anything. Growing food, gardens. Create a better world and do it yourself. Okay, thanks very much.